Hello, this is Dr. Paul Cottrell, and I'm going to be reading Chapter 8 of Parah Adumah by Maimonides. When a person was carrying water for the ashes of the red heifer on his shoulders, and he stood and delivered a halakhic ruling for others, rendering a judgment, a woman performed chalit, chalis, I can't even pronounce this word, chalitza, in his presence. A girl performed Mayim in his presence. He gave directions to others, killed a snake or scorpion that did not present a threat to him, or took food from the market to set aside. The water is disqualified. The rationale is that he occupied himself with another activity before placing the ashes on the water. If, however, he took food in order to eat and ate while he was proceeding on his way, or killed a snake or scorpion that was preventing his progress, the water is acceptable, for these activities are necessary to carry the water. This is the general principle. Any activity that is considered as work which was performed before placing the ashes on the water, whether he stood still or not, disqualifies the water. When he performs an activity that is not considered as work, if he does not stand still, the water is acceptable. If he stands still, it is disqualified. If he was walking while carrying such water, and while he was walking, he made an opening to walk through, the water he is carrying is acceptable, even though he made the opening with the intent of closing it afterwards. If he closes it before placing the ashes on the water is disqualified. Similarly, if he dries fruit to eat, even if later he intends to dry the remainder, the water is acceptable. If he dries the remaining fruit before placing the ashes on the water, it is disqualified. The following laws apply if one was eating while carrying such water. He left over some food and cast the leftovers under a fig tree or under a net used to dry figs. If his intent was to prevent the food from perishing, the water is disqualified because he performed the work. If he cast it away because he no longer needs it, the water is acceptable. When a person drew water to sanctify it and entrusted it to a watchman to oversee, the water is not disqualified. If the owner performed work because he entrusted it to a watchman, if the watchman performs work, he disqualifies it because the water is in his domain and he takes the place of the owner. If two people are watching such water and one performs work, the water is acceptable because the other is watching. If the first returned to his watch and the second stood up and performed work, the water is acceptable. The water's status is maintained unless all the watchmen perform work at the same time. The following rules apply when a person sanctifies water with one hand and performs work with another. If he sanctifies the water for himself, he disqualifies it because he performed work before casting the ashes on the water. If he sanctifies water for his colleague, the water is acceptable because a person does not disqualify a colleague's water with the performance of such work. For the performance of work does not disqualify the act of sanctification. If it disqualifies only the water, and that only when one performing the work is a watchman or the owner. When a person sanctifies water for himself and a colleague at the same time, his water is disqualified because of the activity he performed in sanctifying his colleague's water. If, however, he sanctifies water belonging to two other people at the same time, they are both acceptable because the performance of work does not disqualify water belonging to the others. When a person fills two buckets with his two hands for himself and sanctifies them at once, they are disqualified. If he sanctifies them individually, they are acceptable. If he sanctifies water for himself with both hands at the same time in one sanctification, it is acceptable. If he sanctify 2 buckets at the same time, they are both disqualified. If with 2 hands he filled 1 bucket of water and sanctified another existing bucket for himself, they are both disqualified. If he filled 2 buckets with 2 hands for another person at the same time, when they are sanctified at once, they're both acceptable. If they were sanctified individually, they are disqualified. If he sanctifies water for another person with both hands at the same time, as one sanctification is acceptable. If with his 2 hands he filled 1 bucket of water and sanctified another existing bucket for another person, the bucket he filled is disqualified, but the bucket he sanctified is acceptable. This is the general principle. Whenever work was performed, when water was drawn, whether one drew the water for himself or for another person, it is disqualified. Whenever water was drawn according to law and then one performed work before placing the ashes upon it, if the water belonged to him, it is disqualified. If it belonged to someone else, it is acceptable. In any situation, when the water is in his hand and he performs work, whether there is a watchman who does not perform work or whether there is no watchman, the water is disqualified. When the water is not in his hand and he performs work, if there is a watchman, it is not disqualified. If there is no watchman, it is disqualified. When a person tells a colleague, sanctify water for me and I will sanctify water for you, and they sanctify water for each other, the first is acceptable and the second is disqualified because he received a wage for sanctifying. If one tells the other, draw water for me and I will draw water for you, and they drew water for each other, the first is unacceptable. The rationale is that since his intent was that his colleague should draw water for him in exchange, it is considered as if he drew water for himself and another person at the same time, in which instant the water is disqualified. The second bucket is acceptable because it is permitted to receive payment for drawing water, and he did not perform work after drawing the water, nor did have an intent regarding another drawing of water. When a person tells a friend, sanctify water for me and I will draw water for you, they are both acceptable. The rationale is that work does not disqualify sanctification, and it is permitted to receive a wage for drawing water. If one tells the other, draw water for me and I will sanctify water for you, they are both disqualified. The water drawn originally is disqualified because it is considered as if you drew water and sanctified it at the same time, and thus caused the water to draw to be disqualified because of the performance of work, and the work sanctified outwards is disqualified because it is as if he sanctified water for a wage, because it is as if he was repaying the debt for which he was liable. When a person goes to sanctify water for the ashes of the red heifer, he may take the key to the closet where the ashes are kept and open it to take out the ashes. If it is necessary to dig out the ashes, he may have a hatchet, take a hatchet. He may take a ladder and carry it from place to place to bring the ashes. In all these circumstances, the water and the ashes remain acceptable. If after taking the ashes for the sanctification, he covered the container in which the ashes were held, locked the door of the closet, or stood the container where the ashes were held upright on the ground before casting the ashes to the water is disqualified because the ashes are acceptable to sanctify other water. But the ashes are acceptable to sanctify other water. If by contrast he stood the container in which the ashes were held upright in his hands so that the remaining ashes would not be scattered, it is acceptable because it is impossible to do otherwise. If he places it down on the ground, the water is disqualified, and if he covers it, the water is disqualified. If he took ashes and saw the amount was excessive and returned some of it, it is acceptable. If he casts the ashes on the water and then returns some the water is acceptable. If he cast the ashes on the water and saw that the amount was excessive and took some to sanctify other water, is acceptable. If he trimmed an olive leaf to cast the ashes, the ruling depends on his intent. If his intent was so that the leaf would not hold such ashes, the water is disqualified. If his intent was to direct the flow of the ashes so that they would enter the container holding the water is acceptable. This completes chapter 8 of Parah Adumah. Please subscribe to all my channels. I have 3 channels on YouTube. I have Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble. Links are in the description of this video. Also, you can be a paid member on my Patreon channel to help support my news coverage. The link is in the description of this video. You can also donate on my website, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Link is in the description of this video. You can donate through Stripe, PayPal, or buy me a coffee on the homepage of the website. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.